Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is a computer-generated reading of Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is free and licensed by Mitchell Heisman for copying and distribution under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivative Works 3.0 United States license. The Punchline Background research for an experimental elimination of self-preservation and other biasing biological factors. It is worth asking, particularly in the present winter of our cultural discontent, whether the original spirit of the Enlightenment, confidence, optimism, eyes to the horizon can be regained, and to ask in honest opposition, should it be regained, or did it possess in its first conception, as some have suggested, a dark angelic flaw? 1370. Edward O. Wilson, Consilience. It may be that the truths which lie ahead wait in ambush for man, that the kinship between speculative thought and survival on which our entire culture has been based, will break off. To be able to envisage possibilities of self-destruction, yet press home the debate with the unknown, is no mean thing. 1371. George Steiner, in Bluebeard's Castle. The owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling of the dusk. G.W.F. Hegel. The value of facts. All scientists are liars. Self-existence, or the suicide that terminates it, is not the central question of philosophy, began Harvard scientist E. O. Wilson's landmark work, Sociobiology. The New Synthesis, 1975. The hypothalamic limbic complex automatically denies such logical reduction by countering it with feelings of guilt and altruism. In this one way the philosopher's own emotional control centers are wiser than his solipsist consciousness, knowing that in evolutionary time the individual organism counts for almost nothing. Now how could I offer an empirical refutation of this position? Fear of death, and other feelings that do appear to be produced by the hypothalamic limbic complex, are comprehensible as products of biological evolution, as adaptations of selfish genes. Yet I think it's safe to say that this view of feelings as genetic adaptations is not an emotional view of emotions. The ability to even conceive of feelings such as guilt and altruism as genetic adaptations requires the ability to deny feelings such as guilt and altruism from countering logical reduction and empirical observation, i.e. when viewing one's fellow human beings and their feelings as material objects. Here we have two conflicting views of human emotions within the scientific method. First, a striving for objectivity that leads one to stand back and subtract emotions that might otherwise bias scientific judgment. This can mean, for example, that fear of death must be repressed or controlled so that it does not interfere with scientific analysis. Second, however, is a contemporary scientific view of emotions themselves, an unfeeling view of feelings as material processes that evolved as genetic adaptations. This can mean, for example, that an emotion such as fear of death is scientifically explainable as a genetic self-preservation mechanism inherited from our human and pre-human ancestors. In the first view, feelings are biases and errors. In the second view, feelings originated as genetic self-preservation mechanisms. This leads to a problem. Wilson posited the reawakening of the highest intellectual aspirations of the Enlightenment through consilience, the unity of knowledge. The attempt to unify all knowledge includes the consilience of self-knowledge. This implies a sociobiology of the sociobiologist. The sociobiologist who attempts to incorporate himself or herself into his or her own theory is ultimately led to a sociobiological explanation of the sociobiologist's own scientific behaviors. What happens when the attempt to subtract an emotional state such as fear of death from biasing scientific judgment conflicts with its normative role as a self-preservation mechanism? The problem is precisely that introduced by sociobiology's triumph over the blank slate. Biological factors are life factors. The attempt to be thoroughly objective by subtracting all biasing life factors, taken to its extreme, may be equivalent to willing death. If objectivity is gained at the expense of subjectivity, then raising the standards of objectivity could lead from indifference to self-interest to scientific investigations that are antithetical to self-interest. So while removing subjective factors can increase objectivity, removing subjective factors could ultimately lead to rational self-destruction. Objectivity, taken to its logical extreme, in an attempt to eradicate all subjective factors that bias one towards life, self-interest, or genetic adaptation, could be equivalent to willing death. If the highest realization of enlightenment aspirations require one to correct the subjective or emotional errors that bias objectivity, then fulfillment of enlightenment through the comprehensive restraint of genetically adaptive feelings could be considered identical with willing death. Scientific progress, then, culminates in suicide. If so, then the fulfillment of Wilson's consilience project would be suicide. Suicide could be considered the central problem of philosophy and science because it may be identical to the possibilities and limitations of objectivity. The greatest possibility of consilience, i.e. reconciling subjective and objective points of view, may be equivalent to suicide. Suicide poses a case in which scientific objectivity and subjectivity bias are most likely to conflict with one another. Wilson implicitly claimed that he could know that, in some cases, his hypothalamic cortex will automatically override his own capacity for logical reduction and objective observation. If Wilson is right, then how much of his theory of hypothalamic limbic complex override is a product of his genes, and how much is derived from evidence from the environment? This problem raises more general questions. In what other domains does a scientist's hypothalamic limbic cortex override his or her capacity for logical reduction? Can we measure the extent to which the theories of a sociobiologist are determined by heredity, are controlled the influence of a sociobiologist's gene propagation mechanisms? Can we determine exactly how much of a sociobiologist's theories are based on evidence derived from the environment, as opposed to the scientist's genes? Can we rate various human sociobiological theories by their genetic adaptiveness for the theorist that proposes the theory? If not, is the sociobiologist a hypocrite, or perhaps even a liar, asserting that genetic adaptation is fundamental to understanding human behavior, yet claiming, as a scientist, to do otherwise? Or is such a sociobiologist simply refuting his or her own theory? Perhaps Wilson could demonstrate that suicide is not the central problem of philosophy by demonstrating how his hypothalamic limbic complex automatically denies his ability to override such logical reductionism and racial discrimination, genocide, or some other potentially genetically adaptive behavior. Or does culture deny such logical reduction by countering it with feelings of guilt and altruism? Wilson's delimitation of suicide as this one way in which the genes are wiser than thought amounts to the attempt to isolate, or sweep under the carpet, the central problem of the very possibility of sociobiological science. The issue of suicide, when confronted, unleashes the problem of the very self-existence, or the suicide of reason that terminates it, of the consilient science of sociobiology. Perhaps his very designation of the problem as solipsism is evidence of a failure to explore how such a problem could subject to empirical examination. Wilson himself seems to admit bias on the subject. If it is wisdom to meekly submit to our genes, then opposing them must be as foolish as the flight of Icarus. If this analysis is correct, how could it be known? If a given scientist disagrees, is it because that scientist has genuinely addressed the problem from standpoint beyond the influence of genetically based impulses such as the fear of death? Or is it more likely that most scientists are simply biased by the fear of death and/or feelings of guilt and altruism? Can I presume a standpoint of greater objectivity myself? If all scientists lie through their genes, how could I be any different? But if it is truly not possible to break the genetic leash, then can we fully know ourselves? Can it be known, for example, if Wilson's science is a slave to his genes?